Professeur à l'université de Pittsburgh et à qui revient l'honneur de conclure cette journée. Il traitera la question suivante, Pragmatism, Inferentialism and Modality in Sellars' Arguments against Empiricism, c'est-à-dire le pragmatisme, l'inférentialisme et la modalité dans les arguments de Sellars contre l'empirisme. Vous avez la parole.
What I want to do this afternoon is place the arguments of empiricism and the philosophy of mind into a wider context by tracing further into neighboring works some of the strands of argumentation that intersect and are woven together in his critique of empiricism in both its two principal then extant forms, traditional empiricism and 20th century logical empiricism. Sellars always accepted that observation reports resulting non-inferentially from the exercise of perceptual language entry capacities, play both the privileged epistemological role of being the ultimate court of appeal for the justification of empirical knowledge claims, what Ode was talking about as the minimal empiricism, and therefore, given his inferentialist semantics, an essential semantic role in determining the contents of the empirical concepts that are applied in such judgments. But in accord with his stated aspiration to move analytic philosophy from its Humean into its Kantian phase, he was severely and in principle critical of empiricist ambitions and programs in epistemology and especially semantics that go beyond this minimal, carefully circumscribed characterization of the cognitive significance of sense experience. I think the lasting philosophical interest of Sellars' thought lies primarily in the battery of original considerations and arguments that he brings to bear against all weightier forms of empiricism. Some, but not all of those, are deployed in the opening critical portions of Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, where the ground is cleared and prepared for the constructive theorizing of the second half. But what's on offer there is only part of Sellars' overall critique of empiricism, and we accordingly court misunderstanding of what is there if we don't appreciate the shape of the larger enterprise to which it's contributing. In an autobiographical sketch, Sellars dated his break with traditional empiricism all the way back to his Oxford days in the 1930s. That break was, he says, prompted by concern with understanding the sort of conceptual content that ought to be associated with logical, causal, and deontological modalities. Already at that point, he said, he had the idea that, quote, what was needed was a functional theory of concepts that would make their role in reasoning, rather than their supposed origin in experience, their primary feature, end of the quote. This telling passage introduces two of the master ideas that shape Sellars' critique of empiricism. The first is the idea that a key criterion of adequacy, with respect to which its semantics will be found wanting, concerns its treatment of modal concepts. The second is that the remedy for this inadequacy lies in an alternative, broadly functionalist approach to the semantics of those concepts, one that centers on their inferential roles, as it were looking downstream to their subsequent use, as well as upstream to the circumstances that elicit their application. That second, inferentialist functionalist semantic idea looms large in EPM. In fact, it provides the raw materials that are assembled and articulated into Sellars' positive account of the semantics of the concepts applied in reporting thoughts and sense impressions. Concern with the significance of modality in the critique of empiricism, however, is almost wholly absent from that work, even though it's evident in articles that Sellars wrote several years before. I don't think that's because it was not, even then, an essential element of the larger picture of empiricism's failings that Sellars was seeking to convey, but rather because it was the result of a hard-won but ultimately successful divide-and-conquer expository strategy. That is, I conjecture that what made it possible for Sellars finally to write EPM was figuring out a way to articulate the considerations he advances there without having also at the same time to explore all the issues that are raised by empiricism's difficulty with modal concepts. Whether or not that conjecture about the intellectual biographical significance of finding a narrative path that makes possible the separation of these aspects of his project is correct, I want to claim that it's important to understand what goes on in EPM in the light of the fuller picture of the expressive impoverishment of empiricism that becomes visible when we consider what Sellars says when he does turn his attention to the semantics of modality. In fact, there's a third strand to the rope with which Sellars first binds and then strangles the excessive ambitions of empiricism. And that's his methodological strategy of considering semantic relations among the meanings expressed by different sorts of vocabulary that result from pragmatic dependencies relating the practices one must engage in or the abilities one must exercise in order to count as using those bits of vocabulary to express those meanings. I'm going to call this the pragmatist element in Sellars' multi-front assault on empiricism. It makes a significant contribution to the early critical portions of EPM, though Sellars does not overtly mark it, as he does the contribution of his inferential functionalism to the later, more constructive portion. The concern with what one must do in order to say and so think various kinds of things remains implicit in what Sellars does rather than explicit in what he says about what he's doing. As we'll see, both the pragmatist and the inferentialist ideas are integral to his critique of empiricist approaches to modality and to his constructive suggestion for a more adequate treatment of modal vocabulary. So first, I want to talk about the inferentialist and pragmatist critique of empiricism in EPM, just to get that piece of the story briefly in place. I think of the classical project of analytic philosophy in the 20th century as being the exploration of how the meanings expressed by some target vocabularies can be exhibited as, in some sense, logical elaborations of meanings expressed already by base vocabularies. The conception of the desired semantic relation between vocabularies, the sense of analysis, varied significantly within this broadly defined semantic project, including definition, paraphrase, translation, reduction in various senses, supervenience, and truth-making, just to name a few prominent candidates. The distinctive 20th century form of empiricism can be understood as one of the core programs of this analytic project, not in the sense that every participant in the project endorsed some version of empiricism, but in the sense that even those who rejected it for some target vocabulary took the possibility of an empiricist analysis to be an important issue, at least to set a legitimate philosophical agenda. Construed in these terms, 20th century empiricism can be thought of as having proposed three broad kinds of empiricist-based vocabularies. The most restrictive kind comprises phenomenalist vocabularies, those that specify how things subjectively appear as opposed to how things objectively are, or the not yet conceptualized perceptual experiences subjects have, or the so far uninterpreted sensory given, the data of sensation, sense data. A somewhat less restrictive genus of empiricist-based vocabularies limits them to those that express secondary qualities, thought of as what's directly perceived in some less demanding sense. And a still more relaxed version of empiricism restricts its base vocabulary just to the observational vocabulary deployed in non-inferentially elicited perceptual reports of observable states of affairs. Typical target vocabularies for the first phenomenalist class of empiricist-based vocabularies include those expressing empirical claims about how things really or objectively are. That is, those expressing the applicability of any objective empirical concepts. And typical target vocabularies for observational vocabulary empiricism include theoretical vocabulary. But all the species of empiricism are concerned with the possibility of underwriting a semantics for modal vocabulary that's used to express laws of nature, for probabilistic vocabulary, normative vocabulary, and other sophisticated vocabularies of independent philosophical interest, such as semantic or intentional vocabulary. The standard empiricist alternatives are either to show how a given target vocabulary can be semantically elaborated from the favored empiricist-based vocabulary, on the one hand, or to show how to live with a local skepticism about its ultimate semantic intelligibility, on the other. At the center of Sellars' critique of empiricism in EPM is an argument against the weakest, least committive, observational version of empiricism, a critique that then applies mutatis mutandis to the more demanding versions. That argument depends on both his inferentialist functionalist semantics and on his pragmatism. Its fundamental strategy is to show how the proposed empiricist base vocabulary is not pragmatically autonomous, and hence not semantically autonomous. Observational vocabulary, he argues, is not a vocabulary one could use, though one used no other. Non-inferential reports of the results of observation do not form an autonomous stratum of language. In particular, when we look at what one must do in order to count as making a non-inferential report, we see that it's not a practice one could engage in except in the context of inferential practices, of using those observations as premises from which to draw inferential conclusions, using the observations as reasons for making judgments and undertaking commitments that are not themselves the report of observations. The contribution to this argument of Sellars' inferential functionalism about semantics lies in underwriting the claim that for any judgment or claim to be contentful in the way required for it to be cognitively, conceptually, or epistemically significant, for it to be a potential bit of knowledge or of evidence, to be even a sapient state or status, it must be able to play a distinctive role in reasoning. It must be able to serve as a reason for further judgments, claims, and beliefs, hence as a premise from which they can be inferred. And that means that one cannot count as understanding, grasping, or applying concepts non-inferentially in observation unless one can also deploy them, at least as premises in inferences, to conclusions that do not, for that very reason, count as non-inferential applications of concepts. So, non-inferential observational uses of concepts do not constitute an autonomous discursive practice, a language game one could play though one played no other. And this conclusion about the pragmatic dependence of observational uses of vocabulary on inferential ones holds no matter what the subject matter of the observations is, whether it's observable features of the external environment, how things merely appear to the subject, or even just the current contents of one's own mind. Here, the pragmatist's concern with what one must do in order to be able to say or think something combines with the semantic inferentialist functionalism about conceptual content to argue that the proposed empiricist base vocabulary is not pragmatically autonomous, since one must be able to make claims inferentially in order to count as making any non-inferentially. And if that's so, then potentially risky inferential moves cannot be seen as an in-principle optional superstructure erected on a semantically autonomous base of things directly known through observation. Now, although this is, I think, his most general and powerful argument, Sellars does not limit himself to it in arguing against the substantially more committed forms of empiricism that insist on phenomenalist-based vocabularies. In addition, he develops a constructive account of the relations between at least one principal species of phenomenalist vocabulary and objective vocabulary that depends on pragmatic dependencies between what one must do in order to deploy each kind of vocabulary. To argue once again, it's the same form of argument, that the proposed empiricist base vocabulary does not form a semantically autonomous stratum of the language. This is his account of the relation between looks talk and is talk. The point of Sellars' parable of John and the tie shop in EPM is to persuade us that the home language game of the looks or seems vocabulary that expresses how things merely appear to us without undertaking any commitment as to how they actually are is one that's pragmatically parasitic on the practice of making in principle risky reports of how things objectively are. For what one must do in order to count as saying how things merely look, Sellars claims, is to, on the one hand, evince the reliable differential disposition to respond to something by claiming, say, that it's green, while, on the other hand, withholding the endorsement of that claim. If that's what one is doing in making a looks claim, then one cannot be wrong about it in the same way one can about an is claim, because one has withheld the principal commitment rather than undertaking it. And it follows that phenomenalist looks talk, which expresses how things merely appear, without further commitment to how things actually are, is not an autonomous discursive practice, not a language game one could play though one played no other, but is in fact pragmatically parasitic on objective is talk, because you can't withhold a commitment that you're not capable of making. Now, my point in rehearsing this, I hope, familiar argument is to emphasize the role played both by Sellars' pragmatist emphasis on what one must be able to do in order to count as saying various kinds of things, using vocabulary so as to express certain kinds of meanings, and by his inferentialist functionalist insistence that the role some vocabulary plays in reasoning makes an essential contribution to its semantic content. Now, thus far, I've confined myself to offering a brief general characterization of anti-empiricist arguments that appear in EPM. None of them involve empiricism's treatment of modality. Next, I want to put those arguments in a somewhat different frame by conjoining them with one that's presented elsewhere and which does turn on the significance of modal concepts. The previous arguments concern the suitability of some vocabulary to serve as the base vocabulary of an empiricist analysis, since plausible motivations for caring about such an analysis typically require that it be semantically autonomous. This one turns on the criterion of adequacy of analysis itself. My remarks here concern Sellars' arguments in his essay Phenomenalism, which, though it was written a couple of years later, can be regarded as a kind of companion piece to EPM. The basic idea of a phenomenalist empiricist semantic analysis of ordinary objective vocabulary is that the expressive work done by talk of mind-independent objects and their properties and relations can be done instead by talk of patterns in, regularities of, or generalizations concerning sense experiences characterized in a phenomenalist vocabulary. Saying that the red curved surface I'm experiencing is an experience of an apple that has parts I'm not experiencing, a similarly bulgy red back and a white interior, for instance, is properly understood as saying something about what I would experience if I turned it around or cut it open. That it continued to exist in the kitchen when I left the room is a matter of what I would have experienced had I returned. The first obvious observation is that an account of objective reality in terms of the power of circumstances to produce, or my dispositions to have, sensations, experiences, beings appeared to, and so on, essentially involves modal concepts. The patterns, regularities, or generalizations in subjective appearances that are supposed to constitute objective realities are modally robust, counterfactual supporting patterns, regularities, or generalizations. Talk about what I actually do experience will not by itself underwrite claims about unexperienced spatial or temporal parts of empirical objects. 20th century logical empiricism promised to advance beyond traditional empiricism because it could call on the full expressive resources of logical vocabulary to use as the glue, as it were, sticking sensory experiences together so as to construct simulacra of external objects. But extensional logical vocabulary is not nearly expressively powerful enough for the phenomenalist version of the empiricist project. So, the phenomenalist conditional terminating judgments, into an infinite set of which C.I. Lewis proposes to translate the non-terminating judgments of ordinary objective empirical discourse, have to use his modal notion of strict or necessary implication. And similar points could be made about other phenomenalist reductionists, such as A.J. Ayer. The consequence of this observation to which I wish to draw attention now is that one cannot use such a strategy in one's phenomenalist empiricist analysis, translation, or reduction of objective talk, and at the same time be an empiricist Humean skeptic about what modal vocabulary expresses. So, essential features of the only remotely plausible constructive strategy of phenomenalist empiricism are simply incompatible with the most prominent skeptical consequences about modal concepts that were characteristically drawn both by traditional and by 20th century logical empiricism. This, I think, is a powerful argument. But Sellars' principal concern in his essay Phenomenalism is with a subsequent point. The conditionals codifying patterns, regularities, or generalizations concerning sense experience that are supposed to correspond to judgments about how things objectively are must not only be subjunctive, counterfactually robust conditionals, but in order to have any hope of being materially adequate, that is, getting the truth conditions of those objective statements even approximately correct, their antecedents must themselves be expressed in objective vocabulary, not in phenomenalist vocabulary. What's true, or true enough, is that if I were actually to turn the apple around, cut it open, or return to its vicinity in the kitchen, I would have certain experiences. It's not, in general, true that if I merely seem to do those things, I'm guaranteed to have the corresponding experiences. for phrased in such phenomenalist terms, the antecedent is satisfied in cases of imagination, visual illusion, dreaming, hallucination, and so on, that are precisely not those that are not bound by the supposedly object-constituting rules and regularities. As Sellars summarizes the point, quote, to claim that the relationship between the framework of sense contents and that of physical objects can be construed on the phenomenalist model is to commit oneself to the idea that they're inductively confirmable generalizations about sense contents, which are in principle capable of being formulated without the use of the language of physical things. This idea is a mistake. End of the quote. And it's a mistake because, quoting again, the very selection of the complex patterns of actual sense contents in our past experiences, which are to serve as the antecedents of the generalizations in question, presuppose our common sense knowledge of ourselves as perceivers, of the specific physical environment in which we do our perceiving, and of the general principles which correlate the occurrence of sensations with bodily and environmental conditions. Here we might think of some of Strawson's writings a decade later. This argument makes evident what Sellars calls the logical dependence of the framework of private sense contents on the public intersubjective logical space of persons and physical things. End of the quote. That is, the phenomenalist vocabulary is not autonomous. It's not a language game one can play, though one played no other. In particular, all the uses of it that might plausibly fulfill many of the same pragmatic functions as ordinary objective empirical talk themselves presuppose the ability to deploy such objective vocabulary. Now, the arguments I've considered so far set limits to the semantic ambitions of phenomenalist and instrumentalist forms of analytic empiricism, first by focusing on the pragmatic preconditions of the required semantic autonomy of the proposed empiricist base vocabularies, and second by looking in more detail at the specific sorts of inferential patterns in the base vocabulary in terms of which it's proposed to reconstruct the circumstances and consequences of application of items in the various target vocabularies. Here it was observed that the material adequacy of such reconstructions seems to require the ineliminable involvement of terms from the target vocabulary, not only on the right side, but also on the left side of any such reconstruction, in the definiens as well as the definiendum. Modality plays a role in these arguments only because the material adequacy of the reconstruction also turns out to require appeal to counterfactually robust inferences in the base vocabulary. Insofar as that's so, the constructive semantic projects of phenomenalist, instrumentalist, and secondary quality forms of empiricism are at odds with the local semantic skepticism about what's expressed by a lethic modal vocabulary that has always been a cardinal characteristic, critical consequence of empiricist approaches to semantics, as epitomized for its traditional phase by Hume and for its logicist phase by Quine. In another massive path-breaking essay of this period, Counterfactuals, Dispositions, and Causal Modalities, completed in February of 1957, just a year after EPM, Sellars argues directly against this empiricist treatment of modality, completing what then becomes visible as a two-pronged attack on the principal contentions and projects of empiricism, only the opening salvos of which were fired in EPM. His principal target here is what he calls the tendency to assimilate all discourse to describing, which he takes to be primarily, quote, responsible for the prevalence in the empiricist tradition of nothing butism in its various forms, emotivism, philosophical behaviorism, phenomenalism, end of the quote. The form Sellars addresses in this essay is the Humean one, that confined in statements of laws of nature, expressed in a lethic modal vocabulary, that lets us say what is and is not necessary and possible, nothing but expressions of matter-of-factual regularities or constant conjunctions. His arguments are directed against the view that holds modal vocabulary semantically unintelligible on grounds of our inability to specify what it's saying about what the world is like, how it's describing things as being, insofar as by using it we're asserting something that goes beyond the endorsing the existence of non-modally characterizable universal descriptive generalizations. Hume had found that even his best understanding of actual observable empirical facts didn't yield an understanding of rules relating or otherwise governing them. Those facts did not settle which of the things that actually happened had to happen, given others, that were at least conditionally necessary, and which of the things that did not happen were nevertheless possible, were not ruled out by laws concerning what did happen. The issue here concerns the justifiability and intelligibility of a certain kind of inference, modally robust, counterfactual supporting inferences of the kind that's made explicit by modal vocabulary. Hume, and following him Quine, took it that epistemologically and semantically fastidious philosophers face a stark choice. Either show how to explain modal vocabulary, the circumstances of application that justify the distinctive counterfactual supporting inferential consequences of application, either show how to explain modal vocabulary in non-modal terms, or show how to live without it, to do what we need to do in science without making such arcane and occult supradescriptive commitments. This demand, by the way, was always the greatest source of tension between empiricism and naturalism, especially the sort of scientific naturalism that Sellars epitomized in his slogan, in the domain of describing and explaining, science is the measure of all things, of those that are, that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not. His so-called scientia mensura. For modern mathematized natural science, shorn of concern with laws, counterfactuals, and dispositions, in short, shorn of what's expressed by a lethic modal vocabulary, is less than an impotent Samson. It's an inert, unrecognizable, fragmentary remnant of a once vital enterprise. Sellars' general recommendation for resolving this painful tension, felt particularly acutely by, and one of the principal issues dividing the members of the Vienna Circle, is to relax the exclusivism and rigorism he traces to empiricism's semantic descriptivism. He says, quote, "Once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship in discourse are not inferior, they're just different." End of the quote. Sensitized as we are by now by Sellars' diagnoses of semantic autonomy claims as essential to various empiricist constructive and reconstructive projects, both in EPM and in the phenomenalism essay, and familiar as we are now with his criticisms of them based on the inferentially articulated doings required to use or deploy various candidate-based vocabularies, it should come as no surprise that his objections to critical empiricists' suspicions of and hostility towards modality follow the same argumentative pattern. For the Humean, Quinean empiricist semantic challenge to the legitimacy of modal vocabulary is predicated on the idea of an independently and antecedently intelligible stratum of empirical discourse that's purely descriptive and involves no modal commitments, as a semantically autonomous background and model with respect to which the credentials of modal discourse can then be invidiously compared. In this case, as in the others, the argument turns both on the pragmatism that looks to what one is doing in deploying the candidate-based vocabulary, here what he calls purely descriptive vocabulary, and on the nature of the inferential articulation of that vocabulary necessary for such uses to play the expressive role characteristic of that vocabulary. The argument in this case is subtler and more complex than in the others, however. For one thing, I take it that Sellars does not deny the intelligibility in principle of purely descriptive discourse that contains no explicitly modal vocabulary. And for another, there are special difficulties involved in, and corresponding delicacies required for, working out the general pragmatist inferentialist strategy so as to apply it to this case by specifying the relation between the expressive role distinctive of modal vocabulary, on the one hand, and what one is doing, in particular the inferential commitments one is undertaking, and using ordinary non-modal descriptive vocabulary itself, on the other hand. The pragmatic dependency relation that lies at the base of Sellars' argument is the fact that, quote, "Although describing and explaining are distinguishable, they're also in an important sense inseparable. It's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate those objects in a space of implications that they describe it all, rather than merely label. The descriptive and explanatory resources of language advance hand in hand." Close quote. Descriptive uses of vocabulary presuppose an inferentially articulated space of implications, within which some descriptions show up as reasons for or explanations of others. Understanding those descriptions requires placing them in such a space. This pragmatist claim about what else one must be able to do, namely infer, explain, treat one claim as a reason for another, in order for what one is doing to count as describing, connects to the use of modal vocabulary via the principle that, again I quote Sellars, "To make first-hand use of these modal expressions is to be about the business of explaining a state of affairs or justifying an assertion." Close quote. That is, what one is doing in using modal expressions is explaining, justifying, or endorsing an inference. So what one is doing in saying that all A's are necessarily B's is endorsing the inference from anything being an A to its being a B. The first sort of difficulty I alluded to a minute ago stems from the fact that there are other ways of endorsing such a pattern of inference besides saying that all A's are necessarily B's. One's endorsement might be implicit in other things one does, the reasoning one engages in and approves of, rather than explicit in what one says. So, from the fact, assuming as I shall that it is a fact, that the activity of describing is part of an indissoluble pragmatic package that includes endorsing inferences, and the fact that what one is doing in making a modal claim is endorsing an inference, it does not at all follow that there can be no use of descriptive vocabulary apart from the use of modal vocabulary. The second difficulty I alluded to stems from the fact that although Sellars may be right that what one is doing in making a modal claim is endorsing a pattern of inference, it's clear that one is not thereby saying that an inference is good. When I say pure copper necessarily conducts electricity, and thereby unrestrictedly endorse inferences from anything's being pure copper to its conducting electricity, I've nevertheless said nothing about any inferences, explanations, justifications, or implications. Indeed, I've said something that could be true even if there'd never been any inferers or inferences, hence no describers or discursive practitioners at all. Those two observations set the principal criteria of adequacy, both for Sellars' positive working out of the pragmatist inferentialist treatment of modal vocabulary, and for his argument that the purely descriptive base vocabulary, invoked by the empiricist critic of the semantic credentials of modal vocabulary, lacks the sort of discursive autonomy the empiricist criticism presupposes and requires. Sellars' central rhetorical strategy in this essay is to address the issue of what's expressed by modal claims about necessary connections by offering, quote, a sympathetic reconstruction of the controversy in the form of a debate between a Mr. C, for constant conjunction, and a Mr. E, for entailment, who develop and qualify their views in such a way as to bring them to the growing edge of the problem, close quote. Officially, Sellars starts off even-handed in his treatment of the vices and virtues of the empiricist, who denies that the use of modal vocabulary can express any legitimate semantic content beyond what's expressed by descriptive, extensional, universal generalization, and the rationalist, who understands that content in terms of entailments, expressing rules of reasoning. In fact, however, as becomes clear when he launches into his own account, he's mainly concerned to develop a version of the rationalist account. As the second half of the essay develops, Sellars marks his abandonment of the disinterested pose by an uncharacteristically explicit expository shift. He says, quote, "It's now high time that I dropped the persona of Mr. E and set about replying to the challenge with which Mr. C ended his first critique of the entailment theory," close quote. Doing that, setting out his positive theory, requires careful investigation of the differences between and relations among 4 different sorts of item. And you might want to look at these on the handout. First is the practical endorsement of the propriety of an inference from things being A to their being B. Second is the explicit statement that one may infer the applicability of the expression B from the applicability of the expression A. Third is the statement that A physically entails B. physical entailment is just the kind of modality he's talking about. And fourth is the statement that A's are necessarily B's. Now, the first of those is the sort of thing Sellars takes to be pragmatically presupposed by the activity of describing, that is, deploying descriptive vocabulary. You've got to be able to practically endorse some inferences. That's putting the concept into a space of implications. That's what makes it descriptive rather than merely labeling. The second one fails to capture such practical endorsements because of the possibility of asserting such statements regarding the expressions A and B without understanding what they express. As I could say something of the second kind if the expressions A and B were in Turkish, say, which meant nothing to me. The virtue of statements like A physically entails B is that they do plausibly codify the practical endorsement of an inference that's implicit in what one does in the form of something that one can explicitly say, without bringing in irrelevant commitments concerning particular expressions, the activity of inferrers or discursive practitioners. The activity of inferring or discursive practitioners. The remaining difficulty is that they seem plainly not to have the same content, not to say the same thing as explicitly modal statements of objective necessity. Sellars' response to this problem is to acknowledge that modal statements do not say that some entailment holds, but to go on to distinguish between what's said by using a bit of vocabulary and what is, he says, contextually implied by doing so. Now, embarrassingly, Sellars says very little about this latter notion, even though it bears the full weight of his proposed emendation of the rationalist account. It's recognizably the same distinction he'd appealed to earlier in Inference and Meaning as the distinction between what one says by making a statement and what one thereby conveys. There, his example is that in asserting the weather is fine today, I say that the weather is fine today, but convey something about what I believe, that I believe the weather is fine. That otherwise uninterpreted example suggests to me that what Sellars has in mind is the distinction between semantic and pragmatic inferences. That's the distinction between inferences underwritten by the contents of what's said or asserted, on the one hand, and inferences underwritten by what one is doing in saying them, on the other. The inference from the weather is fine to it's not raining is of the first sort. The inference from my asserting the weather is fine to Brandom believes the weather is fine is of the second sort. Inferences of those two kinds may generally be distinguished by the Frege-Geach embedding test. Look to see whether those who make the inference in question also endorse the corresponding conditional. If the weather is fine, then it's not raining is generally true. Well, if the weather is fine, then Brandom believes it's fine is not generally true. If that's in fact the distinction that Sellars is after, then it seems to me that the view he's expounding and defending can be put less paradoxically if we do not take a detour through entailment statements, but concern ourselves directly with the relations between the endorsement of patterns of inference and modal statements. The underlying rationalist insight is a pragmatist inferentialist one. What one is doing in making a modal claim is endorsing a pattern of inference. Modal vocabulary makes possible new kinds of sayings that have the pragmatic effect of endorsing inferences. To say that is not yet to say what they say. It's only to say what one is doing by saying them. But it does already settle the pragmatic significance of such modal claims in the sense of their appropriate circumstances and consequences of application. If one practically endorses the pattern of inference that treats classifying or describing anything at all as an A as sufficient grounds, all on its own, as Sellars says, in order to capture the way the pattern of inferences in question is counterfactually robust, for concluding that it's a B, then one is committed to the claim that all A's are necessarily B's. And commitment to that modal claim is commitment to practically ratifying that pattern of inference. Assuming, as Sellars has claimed, that using ordinary, non-modal descriptive vocabulary requires practically endorsing such patterns of inference, that's what he means by situating descriptions in a space of implications, that means that anyone who has the practical ability to deploy purely descriptive vocabulary already knows how to do everything he needs to know how to do to deploy modal vocabulary as well. He need not actually do so, since practically undertaking those inferential commitments does not require that one have available a language with vocabulary permitting one to do that by saying something. But all a practitioner lacks in such circumstances is the words to hook up to discriminative and responsive abilities that he already has. In this precise sense, the ability to deploy modal vocabulary is practically implicit in the ability to deploy non-modal descriptive vocabulary. So Sellars has claimed that the activity of describing is unintelligible except as part of a pragmatic package that includes not just the making of inferences, but the making of counterfactually robust inferences, the sort of inferences involved in explanations and licensed by explicitly modal statements of laws. He sums up the claim admirably in the title of another one of his early papers, Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them. Parenthetically, unfortunately, everything after the title of that essay is almost completely unintelligible, but it's a wonderful title. Grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word, Sellars says. And for descriptive concepts, that use includes not only sorting inferences, however fallibly and incompletely, into materially good and materially bad ones, but also among the ones one takes to be materially good, to distinguish, however fallibly and incompletely, among the ones one takes to be materially good, between counterfactual circumstances in which they do and counterfactual circumstances in which they do not remain good. Part of taking an inference to be materially good is having a view about which possible alternative collateral premises or auxiliary hypotheses would and which would not infirm it. Chestnut trees produce chestnuts unless they're immature or blighted. Dry, well-made matches strike unless there's no oxygen. The hungry lioness would still chase the antelope if it were Tuesday, or the beetle on a distant tree crawled slightly further up the branch, but not if the lioness's heart stopped beating. The point is not that there's any particular set of such discriminations that one must be able to make in order to count as deploying the concepts involved. It's that if one can make no such practical assessment of the counterfactual robustness of material inferences involving those concepts, one could not count as having mastered them. Against the background of this pragmatist inferentialist claim about what's involved in the ordinary descriptive use of concepts, Sellars' claim, as I'm reading him, is that explicitly modal, law-like statements are statements that one is committed or entitled to whenever one is committed or entitled to endorse such patterns of counterfactually robust inference, and commitment or entitlement to which, in their turn, commit or entitle one to the corresponding pattern of inference. Saying that about them settles what one needs to do to use such modal statements. It does not say how one is thereby describing the world as being when one does. It does not, in particular, describe a pattern of inference as good, though that saying does, in its own distinctive way, express an endorsement of such a pattern. It doesn't do those things for the simple reason that the use of modal descriptions is not, in the first instance, descriptive. It codifies explicitly in the form of a statement a feature of the use of descriptive expressions that is indissolubly bound up with, but not identical to, their descriptive use. Nonetheless, in knowing how to use vocabulary descriptively, one knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to use modal vocabulary. And that's enough to show that we cannot be in the Humean predicament presupposed by the empiricist challenge to the intelligibility of modal vocabulary. For one cannot know how to use vocabulary in matter-of-factual descriptions, the cat is on the mat, and not have any grip on how to use modal, counterfactual, and dispositional vocabulary. It's necessary for live cats to breathe. The cat could still be on the mat if the mat were a slightly different shade of blue, but not if it turned into soup. The cat would probably leave the mat if it saw a mouse, and so on. Although explicitly modal vocabulary is an in principle optional superstructure on practices of deploying descriptive vocabulary, what it expresses cannot be mysterious in principle to those who can engage in those base-level practices. In taking this line, Sellars quite properly sees himself as reviving a central idea of Kant's. The ability to use empirical descriptive terms such as mass, rigid, and green already presupposes grasp of the kind of properties and relations made explicit by modal vocabulary. It's this insight that led Kant to the idea of pure concepts, or categories, including the alethic modal concepts of necessity and possibility that articulate causal laws, which concepts must be available a priori because, and in the sense that, the ability to deploy them is presupposed by the ability to deploy ordinary empirical descriptive concepts. The categories, including modality, are concepts that make explicit what's implicit in the empirical descriptive use of any concepts at all. Though the details of which laws, the statements of which express counterfactually robust patterns of inference, actually obtain, is an empirical one, that empirical descriptions are related by rules in the form of laws, which do support counterfactually robust inferences, is not itself an empirical matter, but a truth about the framework of empirical description. I want to call the underlying insight the Sellars thesis about modality. It's the claim that in being able to use non-modal, empirical descriptive vocabulary, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to deploy modal vocabulary, which accordingly can be understood as making explicit structural features that are always already implicit in what one does in describing. All right, well, now I'm in a position to draw my story to a conclusion. Articulating and justifying his version of the Kant-Sellars thesis about modality is Sellars' constructive response to the empiricist tradition's nothing-butism about modality. Its demand that what's expressed by modal claims either be shown to be expressible in non-modal terms or be dispensed with entirely by semantically fastidious philosophers and scientists. This complements and completes his demonstration in the phenomenalism essay that this critical consequence of an overambitious empiricism is in any case incompatible with any constructive empiricist effort to reconstruct or replace the use of target vocabularies, such as objective descriptive vocabulary, primary quality vocabulary, and theoretical vocabulary, in terms of the favored empiricist base vocabularies, if that effort is subject to even the most minimal criteria of material adequacy. Together, these arguments show what Sellars eventually made of his early intuition that the soft underbelly of empiricism, in both its traditional and 20th century logistical forms, is its implicit semantics, and particularly its semantic treatment of modality. Now, my overall aim in this talk has been to place the arguments against empiricism presented in the first half of Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind in the larger context opened up by laying them alongside the further battery of arguments that are aimed at that same target that derive from the consideration of that tradition's views about modality. And I've been concerned to show that the methodological strategies that guide all these discussions are Sellars' pragmatist insistence on looking at what one must be able to do in order to deploy empirical descriptive vocabulary, and his rationalist commitment to the necessary inferential articulation of the concepts expressed by the use of such vocabulary. I think that even 50 years on, there's still quite a lot of juice to be squeezed out of these ideas. But I want to close with another, perhaps more frivolous suggestion. Every sufficiently engaged reading becomes a rewriting. And I've been offering here, inter alia, the outline of a different narrative strategy that Sellars could have adopted in the late 1950s. Under some such title as The Limits of Empiricism, he could have represented the material that in fact appeared as roughly the first half of Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, and the second halves each of Phenomenalism and Counterfactual's Dispositions and Causal Modalities, organized around and introduced in terms of the themes that I've traced here. It's interesting, I think, to speculate about how his reception might have been different and about where we would find ourselves philosophically today had this been the shape of Sellars' first book. Thank you.
Bien, je remercie Robert Brandom pour sa conférence. La discussion est ouverte. Qui souhaite poser une question? Yes?
Just a very general question about trying to remember and making it explicit, where I think there was some footnotes and so on about Sellars takes a line where he uses counterfactual robustness to give you the concept of the concept as opposed to as opposed to just leaving open the game of collateral commitments. And And then similarly, in the response to McDowell, somewhere you sort of say you could take this Sellarsian move if you want to. Then you wrote some of this stuff. And how do those two relate? Does it turn out that in making it explicit you didn't want or need to do a certain thing that then you could do with this later stuff? Or how do they relate?
Okay, well, the underlying discussion that Jim is talking about is seeing Quine as having raised a pragmatist challenge to people who wanted to talk about meaning or content, transposed into the inferentialist key. It's saying, look, if there really is a difference between inferences whose content is underwritten by contingent facts about the world, just the way the world happens to be, on the one hand, and inferences that are underwritten by relations between concepts on the other, a version of a synthetic analytic distinction, Quine wants to know, what difference does it make in the way we use those expressions? And of course, he considers various alternatives. Maybe the conceptual ones are held true come what may. So, well, no, that doesn't seem to be the case, and so on. And Sellars, in his essay on the synthetic a priori, gives a straight solution, a straight pragmatist solution to that question. He says the difference is that the concept constitutive inferences, the ones that articulate the contents of concepts, are all and only the counterfactually robust ones. Well, being counterfactually robust, that's a feature of the use of the expressions in inference, so that's respecting the rules of the Quinean pragmatist challenge. Sellars acknowledges that that's a revisionary use, because on that account, in order to know the content of your concepts, you need to know what laws govern those concepts. So to grasp the content of your concept copper, you've got to know what laws of nature govern copper. And that's not something you can tell just by introspecting or being in your armchair. You've got to go into the laboratory to do it. Maybe you can tell what your conception is, but the concept you're going to get only empirically. But nonetheless, he says there's a way to distinguish for us inferentialists between the inferences that are constitutive of a concept and those that are not, compatible, of course, with seeing conceptual change, because we can discover new laws of nature. We can accept that we're not currently omniscient about that. That's an issue about, I think, okay, and as Michael said in his paper earlier, Sellars carefully distinguishes between a notion of concept, of meaning, of content that he's going to use as a technical notion and ordinary senses of it, in which we want to say, well, of course I know what I mean just by thinking about it. It's what I mean. Our theorizing or reconstruction of the ordinary concept answers to our intuitions, to the kind of ordinary things that we're inclined to say about meaning, about concept, and so on. The theoretical one doesn't. We're making up a philosophical theory, and we can use the notion of conceptual content any way we like, as long as we're clear. As long as we're clear about it. Sellars acknowledges he's doing the second thing, so he's not worried about the counterintuitive consequences of it. Nonetheless, that's an issue about how we ought to individuate concepts. Nothing in the story that I was telling about modality requires us to take a stand on that issue about when we've got two concepts, when we've got one, when a connection is a conceptual connection, and when not. All that matters for this argument is that you can't count as saying something conceptually contentful unless you distinguish in whatever rough and ready way some inferences as materially good and others as materially bad. And among the ones you treat as materially good, it makes some sorting, however fallible and incomplete, of the additional circumstances under which it would still be a good inference. The lioness is going to chase the rabbit. Well, you've got to have some idea that there's some circumstances under which she still would and others under which she wouldn't. That point is all we need in order to run the argument against the empiricist criticisms of modality that I was making, quite apart from what technical decisions we make about how we individuate concepts.
Okay, it was that very last part that I thought was bearing on the first problem, but they're independent. Okay.
Well, I mean, bear on it, and sure, that's something to keep in mind when one is constructing a theory of meaning, but it doesn't by itself require you to take any particular stand on that, I think.
Michael Williams?
I don't want to rehearse my own worries about, semantic minimalism and the way you deploy the word descriptive is. Let me ask you about the relationship between this and the view that you hold in making it explicit, and tell me if there's a change or whether I'm just misunderstanding what you've now said. In making it explicit, you seem to argue that there's an expressive use to purely logical vocabulary without any commitment to its being modal. I mean, and the view seems to be that showing certain material inferential patterns in one's linguistic practice, and maybe with some practical endorsement or resistance to them, would be sufficient to confer propositional contents on the propositions. Let's even say holophrastic propositions of some primitive language game. And that would be before one had paradigmatically the conditional to allow one to say if P then Q. I mean, that would be an expressive addition, but it wouldn't be a necessary condition on propositional content. I'm wondering whether here you're actually inching towards the view that the minimal possible package is actually richer than you thought it had to be at the time of making it explicit, and that if words functioning something like if, so, and because, which, and in a richer sense than even the propositional calculus captures, because I know you're sympathetic to Ryle's view that the ordinary language ifs are already modal. I mean, because, if you walk under the ladder, you'll have bad luck. No, you won't. You can walk under the ladder as much as you can, right? Walk under the ladder as much as you like, and it won't make any difference. That you're not really going to be in the game of describing unless some interchanges, something like that, are always already in the game of giving and asking for reasons. That looks like as if your view of the minimal possible standalone language might now be richer than the minimal view that might have been implied by making it explicit. And there's an element of that in CDCM, I think, where Sellars is inclined to add at least some element of reasoning about reasons as what marks the transition between genuinely having reasons and merely having causes, although you might have a kind of linguistic practice that only had causes. Anyway, I don't know, Bob. You see what I'm getting at?
Well, I do, and it's an important issue, but let me try and be clear about framing it. So one of the things I'm aiming to do in making it explicit is to say what a minimal discursive practice would be. That is, what the minimal conditions on what you have to do are, such that some of those doings count as saying that things are thus and so, expressing, asserting propositions. This is a somewhat perverse, a quite unusual philosophical enterprise, and some have found it a perverse one. It's been described as vandalizing Neurath's boat, as if you think of his boat that was our inquiry, our practice that we're keeping afloat, then what I'm doing inter alia in making it explicit is trying to see how many bits of the boat you could throw overboard before it sinks. where sinking would be not being able to express propositions anymore. Now, you might say, well, why would you want to do that? It's sort of a perverse enterprise. Well, if you want to know what dolphins or chimps or extraterrestrials or computers would have to do to count as talking, then this is a sensible thing to do. On the other hand, I also have a good Popperian methodology about that job of stripping down. That is, I'm concerned to make the strongest, Popperian, most easily falsifiable claims that are not actually falsified by the evidence that I've got in this sort of theoretical sense of evidence. And so looking at that, it seems to me that I can describe a game of giving and asking for reasons in which some performances have the pragmatic significance of assertions. They can serve as premises and conclusions of inferences and therefore are propositionally contentful, even if you don't yet have in the language propositional attitude ascribing locutions that let you say that somebody is making a claim or expressing a belief. I claim that, as far as I can see, you can make sense of having a practice of giving and asking for reasons in which you don't yet have conditionals or other logical vocabulary that would let you say that one claim is a reason for another, which, I mean, the practice wouldn't be very much like our practice, because though you could contest someone's claim and make him give some premise from which it followed, if you disagreed about the inference in this kind of primitive practice, there's no way to argue about the inference. You can just accept it or reject it. Now, as far as I can see, that's still compatible with your being able to give and ask for reasons in the sense that would make things able to be premises and conclusions of inferences, and therefore, in the sense that I give to it, propositionally contentful. But maybe not. The whole German idealist tradition that insisted that consciousness presupposes self-consciousness did so on the basis that unless you can be critical, unless you can give reasons for one thing being a reason for another, you're not in the game of reasoning yet. My colleague John McDowell, who, as far as I can see, is right about almost everything, believes that they're right about that, and that the level of rational but not yet logical creatures, discursive but not yet having the expressive resources of logic, that I want to consider, he says, no, you can't have that. Indeed, he thinks propositional attitude, ascribing locutions, semantic vocabulary, intentional vocabulary, he thinks that all comes as a package with ordinary description. Unless you can do all of that, you don't count as doing any of it. So Michael is now saying, well, aren't you edging towards that sort of a view here? Well, no, this is my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I meant to be somewhat careful about that, as it seems to me, at least in most of this essay, Sellars is, though you're quite right. He, in an ending flourish, talks about our having to be able to give reasons about reasoning. No, this is what I say, that you don't yet need to be able to codify counterfactually robust inferences in the form of conditionals in order to accept some of them and reject others, and so practically attribute conceptual content to them. Now, you said if, so, and because, the title of that deservedly classic article of Ryle's. Well, so and because don't form conditionals. Those are particles that show that you're giving a reason. Now, I do claim, all right, you don't really need those particles. It would be enough if we could just sort of tell when people were giving reasons without having to explicitly mark it. But suppose you do have those. Those are not yet logical vocabulary for me because they don't form new sentences for which reasons can be given, reasons demanded, from which conclusions can be derived. They're just marking the goodness of a transition. And I say you have to be able to discriminate the goodness of an inferential transition. So throwing those words in isn't yet moving us up to the logical level. In that quote from Sellars' describing when he broke with empiricism, his description in the 30s, he says it was the treatment of the logical, alethic, and deontic modalities that he was looking at. Well, by logical modalities, he means logic, including modal operators that would codify the logical goodness of an inference. The alethic, he doesn't say alethic, it's physical necessity. Well, that's the one he cares about for philosophy of science. That's the one I was principally talking about. And deontic, of course, he's talking about normative vocabulary. My own view is that he had the same view about all of those, and it's the view that I was articulating for the more narrowly modal case. That is, all of those have the Kantian categorical function of making explicit in the form of claims practical abilities that you have to have in order to use ordinary descriptive vocabulary. That's true of the normative no less than the modal vocabulary. It's true of logical vocabulary. In the idiom of making it explicit, that's to say that they're all, in the broad sense I give the term there, logical vocabulary. In the more finely articulated idiom of between saying and doing, my most recent book, that's to say that they have this very finely articulated expressive role of being universally explicative, elaborated and explicative. But that's just a more elaborated account of what I meant by logical in making it explicit. Yes, please.
I don't think if you think that Sellars agree with you that we can have this mean account of intentionality without what you call logic. So, because for example, if you take, I think it is mental events, it's quite clear that he agreed with the human Leibniz, with the idea that most of human behavior is just like animal behavior, just a kind of pronto reasoning, not really reasoning. But that we have some basic capacity for reflection. And then when he explained what we can do with what Leibniz called reflection, he uses logic because codifying patterns of inference, for instance, it is quite clear about that. I don't know.
Certainly, there are lots of things Sellars says that are incompatible with the minimal notion of giving and asking for reasons that I've got.
It's just about the question of how much we can give up of the boat. That's the question. Maybe with modality, we can have an expressive account of modality and say that it's a further step. But it's really a question about the basic.
Right. No, I mean, many times he says things that require more. I mean, for instance, the Rileyans in EPM already have full semantic vocabulary, so they can talk about the meanings of their expressions. And in the early papers collected in that Pure Pragmatics and Possible Worlds, I say that's a pretty big theme, that it only gets to be reasoning when we can reflect on it in a certain way and have the vocabulary explicitly to do that. So that much is clear, that very often he says you need the bigger package. He is not univocal on this issue, though. And sometimes he'll make a transition. I don't know, Michael, do you remember just how that passage goes, where he makes the transition from talking about us responding to things as reason to saying, well, and we reason about reasoning.
This is the end
of CDCM. Yeah.
I'm wondering on reflection whether it's to do with something, it might not be something that bothers you, whether it's we can't in certain important ways rationally revise patterns of material inference unless we can reason about reasons, although they could drift into new
Right, and the question is whether they
have to be the distinction, actually.
And the question is whether that kind of drifting, mere drifting, if that's all they can do, whether that's compatible with it really being material inferences that we've got, and hence concepts and so on. So, as I say, he often explicitly asserts that we need more. But there are other things he says that don't seem to be taking that position. So I won't attribute this view to Sellars, except about, his solution in this essay about modality, I think, does turn on our not needing to have modal vocabulary in the language. But that could be special, a special case. As I say, semantic vocabulary is even more of a challenge for this, and that he always seemed to think you needed to have for it to be talking that you were doing. So in that regard, I'm not following Sellars in my own views.
To follow on this metaphor of the boat changing its bits, not all at
vandalizing the boat.
Yeah. What would the relation as you construe them between Sellars' position and Neurath's position to this respect?
Well, let me say generally that this search for the minimal conditions, one of the things that makes it perverse is, why wouldn't you just want to understand how we work, how it is with us? Why think about this very abstract question of what the minimal conditions are? And I think Sellars didn't much think about that minimal condition. He was more concerned with how we work. We know a lot about our embodiment, how we get through the world, and so on, and that was what he cared about, not how some aliens who were constructed very differently from us would work. I think the big difference between Sellars and Neurath in the vicinity is Neurath was the head of the naturalist wing of the Vienna Circle, with Schlick as the head of the empiricist wing, and Carnap trying to get them to talk to each other. He sort of felt tugs in both directions. But when there was a collision, particularly over the issue of modality, Neurath would always pick the naturalistic side. There can't be a problem about modality because science turns on it. Science is a matter of laws. So if the empiricist criterion of meaningfulness says there's something wrong with modality, so much the worse for the empiricist criterion of modality, whereas Schlick was absolutely the other way in it, Carnap trying to mediate between them. Neurath was a thoroughgoing naturalist. That is, he did not just think that science was the measure of all things with respect to describing and explaining, but period. So he was a reductive naturalist about normative vocabulary as well. And Sellars never even flirts with that possibility. For Sellars, there's this big division between what science is authoritative about and the normative relations that articulate our, he didn't use the word life world, that is the background against which we can, for instance, talk, engage in scientific theorizing, and so on. So Sellars more or less explicitly turns away not just from Schlick, but from Neurath's kind of naturalism. And I would say that was the big difference between them.
Yes, please. Yes.
I haven't read the teaching, so I don't know what you say there. But I strongly agree with what you said today, because clearly the rejection of empiricism passes through the modality, reflection on modality. If you read Hume, it's absolutely clear that you can't move it just like that. But my question is just curiosity, and what about because the modality we were talking about it are connected with laws and empirical laws, and so this can explain the assertion of Sellars in Empiricism, philosophy of mind, where he says that science is just a development of common sense. And that clearly it's just like that we make commitment, and the content is developed by science, discovering the actual laws. Okay. But my question is, what about ontology? What about the stronger notion of modality? In all possible worlds. What is the implicit commitment about the categories, if you want, in classical conception? Basic.
Well, I mean, I want to say two things. So, the reason Sellars identified himself with Kant was that he saw Kant as being the first one who understood that there were essential features of the whole framework of empirical description and explanation, which could be expressed in sentences, but when you did, those sentences were not themselves descriptions of how things were, but were something like the making explicit of these framework features, without which you couldn't have the notion of description. And in particular, Sellars' own way of developing that, at least as I read him, was to say, description requires embedding in a space of implications, and when we make those implications explicit, we're not in the same way describing how things are, but rather making explicit one of these framework things. So that notion of categories, of concepts whose job it is to make explicit features of the ordinary practice of giving and asking for reasons, that's a category that's definitely in play in the reading of Sellars that I'm giving and that I endorse. More specifically on sort of contemporary modal metaphysics and ontology, I see the modal revolution that swept through analytic philosophy in roughly the last third of the 20th century as having had three phases. And the first one was when Kripke showed how to give a class of complete semantics for modal logical expressions that since C.I. Lewis had been kicking around, since the 19-teens, but nobody had a semantics for them. Kripke, at 14 years of age, came up with these complete semantics for them. That was the first wave. The second wave was when people like Montague, David Lewis, David Kaplan, and Stalnaker saw how to extend the apparatus of possible worlds that he'd used to give us semantics for modal logical expressions, to give us semantics for non-logical, non-modal expressions, for ordinary expressions. So in the example that David Lewis, my teacher, would use, if you represent a proposition by the set of possible worlds in which it's true, and you represent the meaning of a singular term by an object that you can track through possible worlds, then you're going to represent a predicate by a function from objects to sets of possible worlds. So walking is going to map each object into the set of worlds in which it walks. Well, then an adverb is going to be like slowly, is going to take one predicate into another predicate. Well, now we know that mathematically we should represent it by a function from functions from objects to sets of possible worlds to functions from objects to sets of possible worlds. From the function that takes each object into the worlds in which it walks to the function that takes each object into the worlds in which it walks slowly. And now when we notice that adverbs come in two flavors, attributive and non-attributive, if I butter the toast in the kitchen, it follows that I buttered the toast, that adverbial phrase, in the kitchen. But if I buttered the toast in my imagination, it doesn't follow that I buttered the toast. Now we can say mathematically exactly what the difference is between the functions that correspond to the meanings of, that express the meanings of, attributive and non-attributive adverbs. And now this has nothing to do with modal logic. It's just an extension of this apparatus, which I believe for the first time in human history gave us a mathematical grip on the notion of meaning. This, I think, was a huge revolution. That was the second stage. The third stage was initiated by Kripke again in Naming and Necessity, introducing specifically metaphysical, I would rather say semantic notions of modality, which have been the basis of various work in ontology and metaphysics and so on. I actually think that third phase of the revolution was one bridge too far. I'm still fixated in the second one. That's the one where I think that the real philosophical work got done and where we should be working. And the kind of modality that matters for that, for thinking about the meanings of adverbs and non-logical expressions and so on, is not the metaphysical modalities that Kripke identifies in Naming and Necessity. So I would far rather, I don't know, it had been 30 or 40 years after Lewis and Stalnaker and those guys gave us a possible world's intentional semantics before Kripke came up with this other idea to distract us from what was really important.
And why?
Maybe because what I care about is meaning. It is the content of the sapient states that make us different from the poor beasts of the field. And it seems to me this, since the rise of the new science, which gave us a mathematical grip on the movements of inanimate things, and the rise of biological science that gave us certainly a formal grip on the way living things work, we're the last frontier, and this is our best hope for really understanding it.
Y a-t-il encore d'autres questions? Apparemment non. Si ce n'est pas le cas, je vais donc mettre fin à cette séance et à cette journée.